Number 10. The Endurance. Scientists have discovered one of the largest shipwrecks in history 107 years after it went down. The Endurance, a lost vessel run by the Antarctic explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton, was found at the bottom of the Weddell Sea. In 1915, the ship smashed into sea ice and sank, forcing Shackleton and his men to make an incredible escape on foot and in tiny boats. Even after resting under 10,000 feet of water for almost a century, the ship still looks the same as the day it went down. The timbers are still intact, and the name Endurance is clearly visible on the stern. The Falkland Maritime Heritage Trust, FMHT, spearheaded the search for the missing ship. They employed a South African icebreaker called the Agulhas II, outfitted with remote-controlled submersibles. The instant these cameras landed on the ship, the mission's leader called it jaw-dropping. "Finding the wreck is a great feat," he continued. "We successfully completed the world's most difficult shipwreck search, despite continually shifting sea ice, blizzards, and temperatures as low as -18 degrees Celsius. We have accomplished what many thought was impossible. It truly is an incredible find." Number 9. A hidden world in Antarctica. Antarctica is often thought of as the coldest, driest, and iciest place on the planet. But life finds a way. While global warming may be accelerating the loss of polar ice caps, there is cause for celebration in the Arctic. Recently, researchers uncovered a mysterious world underneath the frozen continent. The secret planet was discovered 1,640 feet beneath the ice in Antarctica. After cutting a hole through the ice, investigators inserted a camera. They saw many hazy, small specks flashing in front of the television stream at the bottom. But the specks weren't caused by malfunctioning equipment. Instead, they found swarms of small amphipods moving in front of the camera's lens. Experts were shocked, since they didn't expect to find any form of life that deep beneath the surface. The existence of this secret world, according to the experts, is undeniable proof of ecology at work. They said they were jumping up and down with delight when they made the discovery. It is one of the polar caps which, altogether, produce 80% of the world's fresh water and 90% of its ice. As a result, this discovery has a significant impact on our Earth, and scientists are working to understand it more. It was found in Antarctica's Ross Ice Shelf. It is the biggest ice shelf in the world and has been subject to several scientific efforts throughout the years. According to the scientists, they happened to come across a structure that shelters a complete ecosystem of amphipods. The scientists sought to gain a better understanding of the many climatic scenarios that may affect the Ross Sea. But instead, they unlocked an undiscovered world and ecosystem. It's a fantastic accomplishment that hopefully will continue to shed light on this frigid and strange part of the planet. Number 8. Tunic in Norwegian Highlands. An Iron Age tunic was found beneath melting snow in the Norwegian Highlands. Other discoveries in the area include Neolithic arrows and bow parts thought to be 6,000 years old. Because of climate change, snow in the Norwegian Highlands and other locations is fast melting, revealing a world of well-preserved new discoveries. The artifact was made between 230 and 390 AD and is among few tunics from this time period that have survived. There were 2 distinct linens available, and the fiber tips proved they were made out of wool. The Lenbreen tunic is a first look at the type of thick clothing used by hunters that once traveled to Scandinavia's ice regions looking for reindeer. It lacked buttons and fastenings and was simply pulled over the head like a sweater. The arrows and bow parts were considerably older, and they were discovered in snow patches, which are natural areas of snow that form when snow melts in the sun. These are one-of-a-kind finds that indicate something is shifting over there. People are locating ancient artifacts in a variety of locations when the snow patches melt, and they are usually fairly well preserved. The Neolithic arrows were shorter than earlier Mesolithic shafts found in Europe, probably due to the hefty weight of their slate points. These artifacts were remarkably well kept for their age and fragility, but as the snow melts faster and weather changes, other artifacts could degrade before being discovered. The number and age of some of these relics is unparalleled in the region's almost century-long history of snowpatch surveys, and as the climate continues to warm and snow melts, It's a wonder what the long-term cost will be for these looks into the frozen past. Number 7. Lava Lake. A massive lake of scorching hot lava was found in a volcano on a distant Antarctic island in the South Atlantic Ocean. It is the 4th molten rock lake known to be on Earth. This unique lava lake was found by scientists from University College London, UCL, and the British Antarctic Survey, BAS, on Saunders Island in the South Sandwich Islands, nearly 1,000 miles north of Antarctica's Weddell Sea. By taking a look at satellite images of the abandoned island taken between 2003 and 2018, the researchers saw that the snow-covered volcano of Mount Michael, on which is generally obscured by heavy clouds, has a lava lake within its crater, between 300 and 700 feet in diameter. While lava lakes are frequently linked with volcanoes, only 7 have been discovered. Because Mount Michael is so inaccessible, very few researchers have ever visited. It has only been visited from the bottom on rare occasions, and no one has ever reached the mount's peak. Have you ever been to a volcano? Tell us about it in the comments below, and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 6. Frozen worms. For the first time since the Pleistocene epoch, 2 ancient worms have started moving and feeding regularly. The round worms were discovered frozen in the Siberian tundra. They were later defrosted and revived in petri dishes. These time-traveling animals are only one illustration of the power of scientific cryoconservation, which is the act of freezing biological materials like organs, tissue, and more to preserve them. The worms were first kept at -4 degrees Fahrenheit in a laboratory. Then, they were defrosted over a period of weeks in a pleasant 68 degrees Fahrenheit climate. The nematodes soon resumed regular movement and feeding. These 2 worms are now the world's oldest living organisms. Originally, both of them were thought to be female, but one of them was discovered as a triploid, which means it has 3 sets of chromosomes and reproduces through parthenogenesis, monosexual reproduction. Some news sites, though, are doubtful of the worms' ancient ties, citing scientists that suspect they were introduced to the permafrost samples through laboratory contamination. Number 5. Jarosite. Deep beneath an Antarctic ice core, scientists uncovered a Martian mineral. It's a yellow-brown mineral called jarosite. It's made when dust gets trapped beneath layers of ice. So far, it's been found on both Earth and Mars. Jarosite also demonstrates how essential glaciers were on Mars. They shaped valleys and also help form the materials Mars is made of, according to researchers. In 2004, the NASA Opportunity rover rolled across layers of fine-grained jarosite on Mars for the first time. The discovery generated news since jarosite requires water, iron, sulfate, potassium, and acidic conditions to be made. These parameters are difficult to meet on Mars, so scientists wondered how the mineral became so prevalent on the planet. Others speculated that it was left behind by the evaporation of small volumes of salty acidic water. But the alkaline basalt rocks in Mars's crust would have neutralized acidic liquid, according to Giovanni Baccalo, a geologist at the University of Milan Bicocca and the study's primary author. Another theory said jarosite could have formed in massive ice layers that covered the Earth billions of years ago. Dust would have collected within ice sheets over time, possibly transforming into jarosite within the watery spaces between ice crystals. But the procedure has never been seen in our solar system. Jarosite can be found on Earth in mounds of mining waste that have been exposed to the air and rain, but it isn't common. It was never expected to be seen in Antarctica, and Baccalo wasn't looking for it, but he was looking for minerals that signal ice age cycles beneath layers of a 5,316-foot-long ice core, which records thousands of years of Earth's history. Deep under the core's ice, he discovered the peculiar dust particles that he suspected were jarosite. Baccalo and his colleagues analyzed how the material absorbed X-rays to confirm it was the mineral. They also analyzed the grains under extreme electron microscopes, which cemented his belief. Number 4. Island in Greenland. Scientists located a new island off the coast of Greenland that they claim is the world's northernmost piece of land that was uncovered by a moving ice pack. The scientists first believed they had landed at Udak, an island discovered in 1978 by a Danish survey expedition. When they checked the exact position, they realized they were on another island, 2,559 feet to the northwest. This tiny island, which measures only 100 feet wide and has a height of about 9 feet, is made up of seabed mud and moraine, which is soil and rock left behind by glaciers. The crew suggested naming it Kekertak Avanerlek, which means the northernmost island in Greenlandic. Several US missions have looked for the world's northernmost island in the past few decades. Dennis Schmidt, an Arctic veteran, discovered a similar island close by in 2007. Although the new discovery was revealed by moving pack ice, the scientists claim its existence is not a direct result of global warming, which has been slowly decreasing Greenland's ice sheet. According to René Forsberg, a notable professor and director of geodynamics at Denmark's National Space Institute, the region north of Greenland features some of the thickest polar sea ice in the world. But he noted it was currently 6 to 9 feet thick in summer, down from 4 meters when he first visited as part of an expedition that found Udak in 1978. Any possibility of expanding territorial claims in the Arctic depends on whether the disappearing feature is an island or a bank. At high tide, an island must remain above sea level to keep its designation. Number 3. Plants under ice. An ice sheet that covers our planet's northernmost region has expanded and receded over the last 2 million years, but Greenland's severe cold and miles-deep ice were supposed to basically be continuous. But new evidence suggests that it's considerably warmer and greener than we thought. What it took to melt the ice and cover it with plants in the past might now be crucial in projecting how the Arctic will respond to future climate change. A long-lost core of soil dug up from beneath mile-thick ice in northern Greenland in the 1960s revealed that it used to be home to a vegetated landscape 1 million years ago, or possibly as recently as 400,000 years ago. Scientists thought they'd find sand and rock in the earth, but instead discovered twigs and leaves. They found frozen plant components, twigs, leaves, and moss, that are comparable to the Arctic tundra seen in Greenland's rare ice-free zones today. The main distinction between the past and present is that the mile of ice which formerly covered this portion of Greenland must have melted. This incredible discovery adds to the growing amount of evidence indicating the Greenland ice sheet melted during a previous warm phase in Earth's history, similar to the one we are currently in, which is accelerating thanks to human-caused global warming. Over the last million years, Earth's climate has been broken by short warm periods that last about 10,000 years, known as interglacials. During this period, there is less ice at the poles and the sea levels rise. One of those interglacials, about 1 million to 400,000 years ago, is thought to be the last time this area of Greenland melted and tundra was able to form on the terrain. Number 2. Woolly rhino. Locals in eastern Siberia found the wonderfully preserved carcass of an Ice Age-era woolly rhino. The creature was discovered by thawing permafrost in Yakutia's Abysky area in northeastern Russia. It is one of the best preserved animals in the region. Most of its internal organs are still intact. The rhino is believed to have existed between 20,000 and 50,000 years ago during the late Pleistocene epoch. According to a specialist, the rhino was between 3 and 4 years old when it died, most likely from drowning. Much of its soft tissue, including parts of the intestines, was still visible. Also, a small nasal horn had also been preserved, which is unusual since these parts typically decompose fast. The horn had signs of wear, indicating the rhino actively used it for food. A local discovered the rhino on the bank of the Tirechtiach River in August 2020, near an area where another baby woolly rhino was found in 2014. Sasha, the name given to the rhino by researchers, was believed to be 34,000 years old. In recent years, large discoveries of bones of mammoths, woolly rhinos, foals, pups, and cave lion cubs have been made in sections of Siberia. In September 2020, researchers announced that they found a well-preserved Ice Age bear corpse in the Lyakhovsky Islands in northeastern Russia. This type of discovery is becoming increasingly common as global warming melts permafrost across large portions of Russia. Number 1. Ice dragon. A fascinating small dragon lives among the ice of South America's Andes Mountains. The Patagonian ice dragon is a glacier-dwelling bug that's only half an inch long. Although the southern Patagonian ice field is an incredible source of fresh water, the rivers of ice are a challenging place to live. The dragon de la Patagonia, a sort of stone fly, has evolved to live in this unforgiving environment. Scientists classify the dragon as an extremophile, or a creature that can survive in harsh ecosystems. This stonefly is the only genuine insect that lives in Patagonia's ice fields. There are two known ice dragon species, Andiperla moranensis and Andiperla willinki, although there could be more. That is all scientists know, according to biologist Isa Matters, since everything else is based on theories. Matters expects many questions about the ice dragon will be answered in upcoming years. He wants to learn how these insects chose glaciers over water as their habitat, and then evolved to such a unique existence. He and his colleagues are hard at work investigating the species' inner workings, like how it lives in the ice field and what it consumes. The ice dragon's blood may have glycerol in it, an organic antifreeze, but the levels and whether it stops the insect's blood from freezing aren't known. Further studies may reveal the truth. Ice dragons could feed on microscopic algae found on the ice. They may also eat other insects from surrounding valleys that are carried over by wind and die on the glaciers. Ice dragons have been observed feeding on cryosonite, a fine powder on the ice composed of microorganisms and other tiny particles.
3. The world's first civilian nuclear submarine. There's been talk in recent years of Russia's alleged plan to build a nuclear-powered submarine for civilian use as part of the country's Arctic development ambitions. The idea was revealed in 2017 by project leader Viktor Litvinenko, a scientist with the government-funded Advanced Research Fund. He told the state-owned news outlet RIA Novosti that instead of missile launchers, the sub would be equipped with robotic vehicles which would carry out seismic exploration and search for minerals in the Arctic. At the time the project was announced, it was still in its early planning stages. Litvinenko's team hoped to develop a 445-foot-long, 47-foot-wide vessel capable of accommodating a 40-person crew and undergoing missions lasting up to 90 days. There are currently no nuclear-powered civilian submarines anywhere in the world, but there are past instances of military submarine technology being adapted for civilian use. In 1997, the civilian submarine Sadko was launched off the Caribbean island of St. Lucia. Measuring 98 feet long, it holds up to 40 passengers and currently operates as a tourist excursion vessel in the waters off Cyprus. It has 22 viewing portholes and has traveled to numerous iconic shipwrecks, including the HMS Cricket and the Zenobia. But the Sadko's main selling point to tourists is the ability to see marine life typically only visible to scuba divers. The Russian-owned sub was designed by the St. Petersburg-based Rubin Design Bureau, which had designed the vast majority of the country's Navy nuclear submarines. Rubin's first attempt at a civilian vessel came during the early 90s with the development of the Neptune, which was followed by the Sadko. The concept of a tourist submarine is certainly innovative. But with a maximum underwater period of 3 days at a time and a top speed of 3.5 miles per hour, you can't really compare the Sadko to the idea of a nuclear-powered scientific vessel that's capable of operating for months at a time in frigid and unpredictable Arctic waters. Litvinenko's proposed vehicle would be more than 4 times its size and would house a specially trained crew of experts with no room for curious sightseers. Updates have been scarce at best since news of the project broke, and while this may seem like an indicator that the idea was abandoned, it's hard to say what Russia's really up to. The country is notorious for the secretive nature of its military and government. Even if the project was put on hold for the time being, it's completely possible that it will be revisited in the future. Whether or not it actually happens has nothing to do with Russia's capabilities, which have been proven time and time again through the development of its many nuclear submarines. In other words, if the Russians want to build a nuclear civilian submarine, they certainly have the technology and expertise to do so. But their decision about whether to move forward with it is most likely a question of priority and funding. Russia values scientific research, but the project could have fallen on the back burner to the country's military ambitions, which seem to be Vladimir Putin's main focus at the moment. Before we continue, drop a comment below about your favorite videos on American Eye, and hit the subscribe button while you're at it. 2. Australian Cold War submarine missions. From 1978 to 1992, the Royal Australian Navy, RAN, carried out 16 top-secret submarine spy missions in the waters off Southeast Asia and the Soviet Union. These clandestine surveillance operations were kept so tightly under wraps that even some of the country's top-ranking government officials were kept in the dark about them. They were carried out using the Royal Navy's 6 Oberon-class diesel-electric-powered submarines, or O-boats, which saw extensive use throughout the Cold War. The missions focused primarily on Chinese and Soviet warships, as well as Soviet-built Indian Navy ships, according to Revale editor John Gatfield. They also operated in the waters off Vietnam and Indonesia. In the meantime, 2 submarines were tasked with keeping an eye on Soviet ships traveling from Vladivostok to the Arabian Gulf via the Coral Sea in an effort to avoid detection. The subs lurked deep below the surface, where their crews waited for passing Soviet vessels. As part of their intelligence-gathering efforts, they followed closely behind the ships and snapped photos while being extremely careful not to crash or have their presence discovered. But these missions always came with risks, and no amount of caution could guarantee that an RAN vessel would go undetected or avoid a catastrophic collision as it came within feet of the ship it was spying on. Australia's Prime Ministers, Defence Ministers, the Chief of the Australian Defence Force, and a handful of other high-ranking defence personnel were the only people authorised to know about the surveillance activities. When one of these submarines got caught in a fishing net and had to service in the South China Sea so that crew members could cut the vessel free, Prime Minister Paul Keating's Defence Minister put an end to the RAN's most dangerous operations. The sub had come alarmingly close to being detected, at which point those in charge changed their minds about the risks being worth the rewards. Crew members were well aware that if they got caught spying, they would be taken prisoner and possibly executed. In addition to being dangerous, life on an O-boat was isolated. Those on board went months without being able to speak with their families, and if anything bad happened to their loved ones during their time at sea, it was withheld from them until their mission was over. Less than 10 crew members knew their O-boat's exact location at any given time, according to journalist Jeffrey Barker, who covered these secretive patrols in depth in 2003 for the Australian Financial Review magazine. In the meantime, they adjusted to the cramped conditions of life on board a submarine, which came with the unpleasant smells of diesel and sweat. In a practice known as hot bunking, multiple sailors shared a bunk and slept in shifts. The crews that operated the top-secret submarines were among Australia's toughest and most skilled seafarers of the day. They put their lives on the line to carry out complicated and dangerous patrols and gathered valuable information amid growing concerns over the expanding Soviet naval fleet. Yet the government refused to acknowledge their service as warlike and denied active service medals to veterans. It was during their attempts to achieve recognition in recent years that widespread knowledge of the highly secretive missions finally emerged. Barker described how Defence Force Chief General Peter Cosgrove was unmoved by submariners' appeals for their service to be recognized. In his response to the requests, Cosgrove said that the O-boat activities were not warlike. Because they didn't apply the use of force, no casualties were expected, no conventional combat operations were involved, and there was no formal declaration of war in place. The ruling came as a disappointment to O-boat drivers, who felt that pursuing intelligence targets from a dangerously close proximity was plenty warlike, considering the risks involved and the nature of the missions. But Cosgrove remained set in his decision, leaving them with the choice to either accept the ruling or fight to change the regulations of what constitutes warlike activity, which was unlikely to happen. To this day, nobody seems to know exactly why the RAN embarked on such high-risk operations. Some former O-boat commanders have speculated that Australia wanted to establish credibility in the eyes of the US and the United Kingdom for its intelligence-gathering capabilities. Others have claimed that the patrols were carried out at the request of the United States, but those who were involved have only disclosed limited details about their work, often citing ongoing security concerns related to modern submarines that continue to carry out sensitive missions. Regardless of its reasoning, the RAN's clandestine Cold War-era operations proved valuable and established the Navy's submarine arm as a legitimate player among the world's top seafaring military branches. One reason for this is because most American nuclear-powered submarines at the time were designed for operating in the deep ocean and were better equipped to attack than to carry out close-range coastal surveillance missions. The RAN's Oberon submarines were the most ideal fleet for the task. In addition to filling this niche role, Australian U-boats patrolled Soviet activity in regions that received less attention from the US and Britain, who were mostly preoccupied with monitoring activity near their submarine bases elsewhere. Without the RAN submarine missions, Soviet operations in the South China Sea would have gone largely unnoticed. In 2021, the United States and Britain reached a historic agreement with Australia that will deliver nuclear submarine technology to the country while remaining committed to non-proliferation standards. The countries involved have reassured that they've consulted with the International Atomic Energy Agency throughout the negotiation process to ensure that they remain compliant. Known as the AUKUS Agreement, the landmark partnership is being touted by the White House as a way to enforce a shared vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific. Critics of the new policy have raised fears that it could increase nuclear risks and accelerate an arms race in the region. 1. Project Azorian. In April 1968, a top-secret Soviet submarine known simply as K-129 sank to the Pacific Ocean floor, roughly 1,600 miles northwest of Hawaii. The Soviets spent weeks searching for the submarine, but they failed to find it and eventually gave up. Several months after the wreck, the US Navy launched an effort to find and photograph the wreck in a mission codenamed Operation Sand Dollar. 3 weeks later, they located K-129 at a depth of 16,000 feet. The team spent weeks photographing it, snapping around 20,000 pictures total. 2 years later, in 1970, Defense Secretary Melvin Laird and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger concocted a top-secret plan to recover the vessel. Codenamed Project Azorian, it was one of the most complicated and expensive intelligence undertakings of the Cold War. It came at an immense cost of around $800 million, which is the equivalent of around $4 billion in 2016 dollars. Carried out by the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, the project was expensive mainly because it required the building of a ship capable of bringing the K-129 wreck to the surface. It would be the deepest salvage operation ever attempted. Dubbed the Hughes Glomar Explorer, the vessel was built under the guise of mining manganese nodules from the ocean floor. The cover story was passed off with the help of eccentric billionaire Howard Hughes, who wasn't involved in the project whatsoever but agreed to lend his name to help mask the ship's true purpose. Work on the 619-foot-long Hughes Glomar Explorer began in 1972. The vessel was equipped with a purpose-built mechanical claw called a capture vehicle. Nicknamed Clementine, it was designed to reach down and grab large pieces of the wreck and lift them into the ship's hold. The operations planners hoped specifically to obtain a nuclear missile, as well as any cryptographic materials that might be on board the sunken submarine. Unfortunately, the Clementine claw suffered a catastrophic failure during the attempted salvage operation, causing 2/3 of the wreck portion that it had raised to sink back down to the ocean floor. But the mission wasn't a complete failure. Part of the wreck was recovered, including 2 nuclear torpedoes. Some crew members later claimed that various other pieces of equipment were obtained, as well as codebooks and other documents that CIA members aboard the Hughes Glomar Explorer showed a particular interest in. The team also recovered the remains of 6 Russian service members who'd gone down with the wreck. They were given a proper burial at sea with military honors. The CIA filmed the entire salvage operation, but the footage remains classified to this day. In 1975, members of the media began to suspect that the cover story that was given to the public to cover up the mission was exactly that, a cover story. Journalist Jack Anderson broke the real story behind Project Azorian in a Time magazine expose in 1975, despite CIA Director William Colby's plea to suppress the story. Anderson claimed that he had heard from Navy experts that K-129 contained no real secrets and that it was a waste of taxpayers' dollars. Numerous other outlets published their own versions of the breaking story after Anderson's expose hit the shelves. The CIA remains secretive about the project and has refused to answer many, if not most, questions about it over the years. The agency has also denied Freedom of Information Act requests seeking documents about Project Azorian, claiming that no such files exist. In yet another of the many twists and turns the story took, Time magazine speculated that Project Azorian itself might have been a cover-up for a more clandestine mission. Perhaps the CIA wanted to tap underwater cables, cover up an assassination, install an underwater missile silo, or implement some sort of secretive high-tech surveillance system. Even if any of that were true, the agency remains tight-lipped, and most of what the public knows about the operation has been revealed through other sources. Engineer Joe Houston, who designed the cameras that were used to photograph K-129 during Project Azorian, shared his experience of the mission to author W. Craig Reed for the 2010 book Red November: Inside the Secret US Soviet Submarine War. Several other participants have given interviews over the years, but the exact details of what the mission recovered are unclear to this day. 4. Canary Girls. When World War I broke out in 1914, the British government encouraged women to register for war service jobs to keep up with production demands and so more men could volunteer to fight. Thousands of women answered the call, and by the war's end, somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million women were working at munitions factories throughout the UK. The hours were long and conditions were dangerous for these munitionettes, who performed grueling physical labor, operated dangerous machinery while exhausted, and exposed themselves to toxic chemicals, including asbestos. Factories were extremely loud, ventilation was poor, and the work was repetitive. The environment made it difficult to focus on the task at hand, yet each employee was held to specific production quotas and quality standards. Each position came with different risks, and some jobs were more hazardous than others. One of the most dangerous positions involved filling shells with TNT. The hair and skin of women who came into regular contact with the explosive turned yellow, earning them the nickname of Canaries. And while many women recovered from this discoloration with no major issues, some suffered from severe health problems related to it, namely a horrible liver malfunction known as jaundice. Throughout the war, an estimated 400 women came down with jaundice, and around 100 people died from it. In addition to the yellowing of the skin, sufferers reported frequent headaches, nausea, hives, and other side effects. Investigators discovered that there were 2 different types of symptoms that came along with exposure to TNT. Irritative symptoms, which were mostly superficial and consisted of things like skin and digestive irritation, and toxic symptoms, including jaundice, nausea, dizziness, and constipation. The women who suffered more severe cases risked the chance of passing their illness on to their baby. Hundreds of so-called canary babies were born during World War I. For most, the condition faded with time. When it became clear that workers were suffering, factories were required to improve their ventilation systems and provide employees with masks. 3. Internment camps and German prisoners. Starting in 1915, England detained German civilians as so-called enemy aliens. An estimated 30,000 Germans were held at internment camps throughout the UK. In the meantime, English, French, and Russians were detained at camps in Germany. When the United States entered the war, German nationals living in the US were classified as enemy aliens. According to then-President Woodrow Wilson's orders, German-born male residents over the age of 14 all fell under the qualifying criteria for being labeled as aliens, even if they'd gained US citizenship. Starting in 1917, around 250,000 so-called enemy aliens had to register their status at their local post office. They were given an identification card, which they had to carry at all times, and they were required to report any changes in address or employment. Women were required to do the same starting the following year in 1918. Altogether, around 500,000 people were registered as enemy aliens. Thousands of German Americans were interrogated, and approximately 6,000 were imprisoned for the rest of the war. Most of the prisoners were sent to either Fort Douglas, Utah, or Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. The detainees contained a sizable number of intellectuals, including 29 members of the Boston Symphony Orchestra and renowned geneticist Richard Goldschmidt. Life was strict at the internment camps. Some prisoners took their own lives, dozens were transferred to asylums, and there were occasional outbreaks of various diseases. But the prisoners made their existences as bearable as possible. Those with valuable skills and knowledge to pass on held courses that their fellow prisoners could take, teaching things like biology, mathematics, languages, and literature. Musicians played and performed together to keep the morale up, and the detainees at several camps turned their surroundings into makeshift German villages. Most civilian detainees were released by 1919, and they had to start their lives over from scratch because the government had seized $500 million worth of their personal property and assets when they were taken prisoner. Regardless of how trivial the charges against a person were, or the fact that they might even be innocent of the allegations they were facing, chances are they lost anything of value that they once owned. The US government defended its decision by claiming that taking people's belongings and property prevented them from being able to financially support the country's enemies. Even the wives of German and Austro-Hungarian immigrants were considered enemy aliens and lost an estimated $25 million of property combined. It may surprise you to learn that the Bayer Aspirin company became a casualty of the massive seizure when it was sold on the steps of its own building in New York. In early 1917, US authorities began detaining German commercial vessels and their crews at American ports. As a result, over 2,000 Germans were held as prisoners of war at a hotel in Hot Springs, North Carolina. The US military began taking German military prisoners long before civilians were targeted. In 1914, the Imperial German Navy vessel the Cormoran pulled into the harbor at Guam in search of fuel and provisions. The American military members stationed there gave the captain two choices: return to sea without enough fuel and supplies, or be detained at Guam. Wanting to avoid an ill-prepared encounter with the Japanese, the captain opted to stay on the island. The US officially cut diplomatic ties with Germany in early 1917 after repeated U-boat attacks on American shipping fleets bound for Europe. At that point, the 353 surviving German military detainees at Guam were sent to the US mainland. Crew members aboard the German cruiser Gaia had a similar experience when they sought refuge from the Japanese at Honolulu in 1914. They were detained, but didn't become official prisoners of war until early 1917. To avoid being destroyed by US Navy vessels in the Atlantic, crew members of the German cruisers Prinz Eitel Friedrich and Kronprinz Wilhelm stayed in various Virginia ports and lived on the ships for several years. They were occasionally allowed to spend time on shore and were eventually given permission to build their own settlement on land. The collection of simple, single-room houses became known as Germantown. It eventually grew to include cafes, a police station, churches, and vegetable gardens. Residents rescued farm animals and also had pets. But they were still prisoners, and when 9 men escaped the encampment in early 1917, the remaining 750 were sent to the more restrictive confines of actual detention camps, where they were kept separate from civilian detainees. Would you try to escape if you were taken as a prisoner of war? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 2. Radium Girls. The United States entered World War I in April of 1917, almost 3 years after it began. Just like in Britain, many women volunteered to work in support of the war effort. One of the main employers was the US Radium Corporation, USRC plant in Orange, New Jersey, where women painted watch dials with self-luminous paint. The paint contained a toxic radioactive substance called radium. It was first identified in the late 19th century by Pierre and Marie Curie, who knew from the beginning that they were working with a hazardous material. One of the main indicators of this were the burns Marie suffered to her hands while handling it. Her husband, Pierre, was reportedly afraid of going near even a small amount of it because he feared that it would burn his skin off or render him blind. The Curies worked with pure radium, and at the time, it was widely believed that the substance was harmless or even good for health in small amounts. Throughout the early 20th century, it became trendy to drink radium-infused water and to use radium-infused toothpaste and cosmetics. People were attracted to its luminescent quality, which made their skin and teeth look brighter. But radium is extremely dangerous, especially when ingested, and the owners and scientists at USRC were well aware of the hazards of coming into direct contact with it. They also knew that the damage could have a cumulative effect over time. And while male workers were given lead aprons to protect themselves from radium, female employees received no protection. They were even told to put their paintbrushes to their lips to get the bristles to form a fine point, because using rags and water would cost more time and materials. Thinking the paint was harmless, the women who worked at the plant handled it without taking any precautions. They even used it to paint their nails and add some glow to their hair, faces, and lips. Women continued to work with radium even after the war. At its peak, the plant in New Jersey employed around 300 female workers. The effects of coming into constant contact with radium eventually began to appear. In 1922, worker Molly Maggia went to the dentist with a toothache. The pain didn't go away, so the dentist pulled several more teeth and Molly's wounds wouldn't heal. She eventually underwent jaw surgery, only for the dentist to realize that her bone was so weak that it crumbled almost as soon as he touched it. Radiation had sucked all the calcium out of Molly's bones, and she also had tumors. Her entire jaw was removed, and she died 8 months after she got her first toothache. Around the same time, another so-called radium girl's spine collapsed, while others suffered from cataracts, skin and throat cancer, tooth and hair loss, and other symptoms of prolonged exposure to radiation. Just like people thought radium was harmless in small amounts, company executives later said that they thought female workers were at far lower risk of severe health effects than their male co-workers because they were handling much less of it. People began suing USRC, and company officials initially denied that radium was responsible for the women's health problems and deaths. They were happy to go along with it when a coroner's jury, which was made up of laypersons, blamed syphilis for Molly Maggia's death. The company also paid for a study that determined in their favor that radium wasn't the problem. Renowned pathologist Harrison Marland investigated the matter for himself and found damning evidence that radiation poisoning was, in fact, the cause of many cases of cancer and other deadly ailments among USRC's radium girls. The ensuing court and medical costs drove the company into financial ruin. No amount of money could stop most of the girls from suffering for years with severe health issues before enduring an excruciating death. The main good thing that came out of the ordeal was the widespread attention that was drawn to the effects of radiation, which led to heightened safety protocols and more oversight when it came to ensuring that standards were being followed. 1. Conscientious objectors. A conscientious objector is someone who chooses not to engage in armed conflict for personal, moral, or religious reasons. During World War I, around 16,000 conscientious objectors opted not to fight. The No Conscription Fellowship was established in Britain in late 1914, several months after the war broke out. Founded by Fenner Brockway, it was dedicated to opposing the introduction of compulsory military service. Thanks to the group's efforts, something called the Conscience Clause was added to the Military Service Act in 1916. This gave conscientious objectors a chance to argue their case against service, with a chance of being excused from it. Most of these 16,000 men who fought for exemption were denied and conscripted into service. Nearly 10,000 of them were allowed to serve as non-combatants in the Non-Combatant Corps, which was formed in 1916. While some conscientious objectors' fellow service members were open-minded to their point of view, others found it disrespectful and inexcusable not to follow orders to fight. They definitely faced harsher treatment than most soldiers and were often considered cowards or seen as shirking their military duties, even though many put themselves right in the line of fire to help their wounded fellow soldiers. Around 6,000 conscientious objectors, known as absolutists, refused to comply with their military orders and were arrested and court-martialed. They were all sentenced to prison time. Inmates were required to stay silent, effectively putting them into solitary confinement. In addition to being maddening, the conditions were unpleasant in numerous other ways. The food was meager, morale was low, and the beds were thin. Men who weren't young and in good shape were especially uncomfortable and prone to physical suffering. Conscientious objectors received extra harsh treatment from guards and were deprived of medical care. At least 70 died in custody or after being released for issues stemming from their time in prison. Things got even worse for some absolutists when the so-called Home Office scheme was introduced in July of 1916. It gave conscientious objectors an opportunity to work at labor camps throughout Britain in lieu of prison time. But some saw any activity under the Military Service Act as government service and therefore refused to participate. Others decided that it was the best alternative to having to serve in the military and took up on the offer. The labor camps weren't the perfect solution to the problem, and for several reasons. In addition to still qualifying as government work in the eyes of some conscientious objectors, there was corruption at the camps, and some even compared the work to slave labor. All conscientious objectors who refused to serve the military in any capacity were released from custody by August of 1919, nearly 9 months after the war ended. Their status followed them around in their civilian lives, making it difficult for them to find decent work or return to the lives they led before the war. Thanks for watching. Would you like to learn more secrets about the world wars? Tell us in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.